Please turn in your Bibles today to the book of Genesis, chapter 16, and place a marker in Proverbs chapter 3. Genesis 16 and Proverbs chapter 3. Today when I read, I'm going to be reading from the New International Version, and we're picking up where we left off last week in a message called Storytime, The Promise. We're looking at a story about a man named Abram. This story is found in Genesis chapters 12 through roughly chapter 20. And last week, we looked at the first part of Abram's story. I began by telling you the meaning of the name Abram. Does anybody remember what Abram means? Randy, what is it? Exalted father. That's right. Abram means exalted father. And it was a pretty cool name to have in Abram's day, unless you weren't able to have children, which was sadly the case in the life of the Abram that we read about in Genesis chapter 12 through 20. So Abram was married to a woman who was barren. She was unable to have children. Her name was Sarai. And every time someone called Abram by name, it was kind of like an insult. It was, I imagine there were probably some people who were very conscious of other people's feelings who refused to call Abram by name because they didn't want to hurt his feelings or they didn't want to offend him. Can't you just imagine Abram being in an airport? He's there with his wife. They're getting ready to go on vacation, and they strike up a conversation with a couple across from them, and that couple introduces themselves, and then they say, "So what's your name?" And Abram says, "Oh, exalted father," which leads to the natural next question, right? "Oh, that's so cool. And how many children has God blessed you with?" Man, that would hurt, wouldn't I wonder if sometimes Abram just lied. He's like, "Oh, I'm Dave. My name's Dave." What a tough situation to be in. We discussed last week how one day things began to change for Abram. When Abram was 75 years old, God visited him. And God made him a promise that he was going to bless Abram and that he was going to make him a great nation. In other words, he was going to make a great nation spring up out of Abram. He was going to give him children that would end up being a great nation. Man, what an awesome day for Abram, right? The day that he got that promise had to be the best day of his life. I guarantee you he was walking around whistling a tune. Unfortunately, though, for Abram, the Lord didn't tell him when this promise would take place, did he? He just told him that it would. And it didn't happen quickly. In fact, we talked last week about how Genesis chapter 15 tells us that 10 years after the Lord made the promise, it still hadn't come to pass. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine getting a big promise from the Lord and it not happening for 10 years? By this time, Abram was 85 years old. His wife was 75, and Abram got frustrated with the Lord. Remember, we talked about it last week. He got frustrated with God that it wasn't happening quickly enough, and he told the Lord that all of the blessings that God had given him didn't even matter because he didn't have anyone to pass them down to. He said, "Lord, basically, everything you've given me, it's just a rental. I don't have anyone to give it to, so I'm just using it while I'm here, and then when I die, it's gone." But in verses 5 and 6 of Genesis 15, we talked about how God took Abram outside, and he told him to look up into the sky and count the stars. And he said, "Listen, if anyone could count the stars, that's how many offspring that you're going to have." In that moment, the Bible tells us that Abram believed God's promise. He believed that God would bless him with children. And Romans chapter 4 talks about this. We read it last week. Romans chapter 4 tells us that Abram faced the fact that his body was as good as dead and that Sarah's womb was also dead. But despite that, it says that he did not waver and that he was fully persuaded that God had the power to do what God had promised. So last week we learned three things. We learned that God gave Abram a big promise, that Abram clung to that promise, and that against all odds he continued to believe. And I encourage those of you who were waiting for a promise, those of you who felt like the Lord had given you a promise that hadn't come to pass yet, I encouraged you to cling to that promise, to go all in, and to believe that it would happen. Well, today what I want us to do is I want us to read the miraculous conclusion of the promise that God made in Genesis chapter 12. To do so, I want us to pick up in verse 1 of Genesis 16, and I want us to read the first few verses there together. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived." What a miracle, isn't it? Man, isn't that just the miraculous? After all these years, all of a sudden, after all these years of waiting and hoping and believing, God's promise came true. Just like that, praise be. You know what, though? This story didn't really finish like I thought it was going to. I guess I thought it was actually going to require a miracle from God, not just a pinch hitter. For me, the way that this happened causes the promise to lose a little bit of luster. Now, most of you know I'm joking. This was not the fulfillment of God's promise, was it? It was just a detour. And not a very good one. I remember a couple years ago, my family and I were driving down to Texas. We had two vehicles, and we were following my GPS, and they were following me. And we got to that area where Oklahoma meets Texas on Highway 69, and they're doing construction for like 300 years. And my GPS told me to get off the interstate, so I got off the interstate, and we went down, and we sat at a stoplight, and we watched all these cars fly by us on the interstate, and then the light turned green, and we got right back on, behind all the people that had just passed us. I feel like that this detour in the story that we're talking about feels a lot like that, doesn't it? It doesn't feel very fulfilling. Today, as we talk about the rest of Abram and Sarai's story, I want to share with you three things that I noticed when reading this. And the first thing I want you to notice today is that God's timing was not the same as Abram's. From Genesis chapter 12, where God first gave Abram the promise, until Genesis 16, when he sleeps with his wife's slave, is a period of roughly 10 years. Is there anyone other than me that thinks that maybe when Abram got this promise at age 75, that he didn't think he was going to have to wait 10 years to see it happen? I mean, anyone else feel that that may be the case, that maybe he thought it was going to happen, the next day? What if it had been you? Can you imagine receiving a promise of something really big in your life, and then waiting 10 years and not seeing it happen? Can you imagine how miserable that would be? I don't think I'd like it very much. I got to tell you, I am not a patient person. I don't think that would be a lot of fun. Now listen, I'll be honest with you. I kind of get how Abram was feeling. If I am really, really transparent with you today, I didn't think that 5.5 years after we planted this church that we were going to be running 35 or 40 people and setting up and tearing down with 7 of those every week. I didn't think 2.5 years ago that we were still going to be setting up and tearing down every week. And that's not because God gave me a promise in either of those situations. It was just based on my expectations of what God was going to do. If you threw a promise on top of that, I'd be getting really impatient. And I don't think that Abram and I are the only people that don't like to wait. I think most of us, when we get a promise, we want it and we want it now. But the fact is that God's plans almost never align to ours when it comes to timing. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed how God never does it when you want him to? And this isn't just about promises. This is about prayers too, isn't it? You ever pray for something, you expect God to fix it tomorrow, and you have to wait a month or 2 or 10 or 12 years? I don't want to put him on the spot, but Patsy, how many years did you pray for Ivan to get saved? It was a long time. Patsy was a blonde when she started. But God's plans almost never align to ours when it comes to timing. And sometimes we get really stressed about that, don't we? Sometimes we get really worried about that. We get really frustrated about that. But there's a reason that we get so frustrated, and I think it's that we're working on the wrong clock. See, to you and I, a year is a long time, isn't it? I mean, it's over 1% of our life. Think about it that way. You don't want to waste a year. 10 years is a really long time. It's roughly 12 or 13% of most of our lives. That is a huge chunk of your life to wait on a promise. That's a big deal. So when we're waiting on a promise and a year or two goes by, we start to get worried that we're running out of time. But to God, a year or 2 or even 10 is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. He's been here forever. And he's going to be here forever. Sometimes I think it's too easy for us to forget that God doesn't work in the calendar that we work in. You know, my dad he lives down in Miami, and he's got this tree, this massive tree in his yard. And he said he went to this museum type place, or, you know, like a botanical garden place, I guess. And they had a tree. It was the exact same type of tree. And it was about half the size of his. And they said that they had aged that tree, and it was over 350 years old. That means the tree in my dad's yard is probably 600 years old, if not double that. Think about that, church. 600 years. And God was here a long time before the tree was there. To God, 1 or 2 years or 10 or 12 is nothing. Peter talks about this in 2 Peter 3:8 when he says, do not forget this one thing, dear friends. Do not forget this one thing. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. 1,000 years are like a day. Time doesn't matter to God. He doesn't work on the same calendar we do. He doesn't work on the same clock that we do. See, I don't think that Abram realized this when he was waiting on his promise to come for over 10 years. 10 years to God is nothing. See, God made a promise to Abram that he was going to make him a great nation, and you had better believe God was going to keep that promise. And if you're here today and God has given you a promise and you've been waiting a long time for it to come to pass, let me tell you something. God is going to keep his promise. It may not be in your time, but it's going to happen. Abram didn't need to worry. God was going to keep his promise, but it wasn't going to be quick because it didn't need to be. The first thing I want you to know is that Abram's time was different than God's. The second thing I want you to notice about this story is that Abram decided to take matters into his own hands. Whew, what a mess he made. Abram and Sarai are talking one day. We read it in Genesis chapter 16. And Sarai says, hey, I can't have children on my own, but you know what? I bet my slave can. Why don't you take her, have a child with her, and I'll start my family in that way. Abram says, okay. Listen, I've said this before, but I think Hagar was probably a pretty good-looking woman. I don't think Abram would have been so quick to say, all right, if she wasn't. So he sleeps with Hagar, and she gets pregnant. She has a child. Now listen, there's something you need to know to truly understand this, and it's this. This was not an uncommon practice in that day. For a woman to have a servant and to give that servant to her husband and to have children in that way. In fact, in a couple of weeks, we'll read about a man named Jacob who ended up having 12 sons, and he had them through his 2 wives and both of their slaves. This was a common practice. It wasn't something new. It wasn't something they just thought of. But I actually noticed something this month when I was reading this story that I've never noticed before. This is going to blow your mind. I don't know. You may have noticed it before. You may be like, well, duh, Pastor. This is the first time I've noticed this. There is no indication whatsoever in the Bible that Sarai knew about the promise. None. See, at this point, she doesn't know anything yet, or at least we don't have any indication that she does. I always thought that Abram and Sarai put their heads together and decided to fulfill the promise for God. But I don't think that's what happened. I honestly think Sarai just wanted a family. She wanted a family. She finally gave up. She finally said, you know what? I'm not going to be able to have children, but my slave can. Let's go ahead and start our family. But Abram, he knew about the promise, didn't he? See, I think that he saw an opportunity to see God's promise fulfilled, even if he had to take matters into his own hands. And he did. At the ripe old age of 86 years old, Abram had a son. He was finally exalted father. He stopped introducing himself as Dave. And can I tell you something? I really believe that Abram felt like the promise had been fulfilled. Church, how many times have you done that in your life? How many times has God given you a promise, or maybe you've been praying for something, and it wasn't happening quite as quickly as you hoped, so you decided to take matters into your own hands? If I just do this, or if I just do that, I think I can make this thing work. If I just twist this a little bit, or if I bend this, or if I adjust this, then it will almost look like what God told me that it would be. If I just kind of look at it with a squint and don't really open my eyes, it's almost just like the promise. It's almost exactly what God said. As humans, we love to help God out, especially we men. We like to fix things, don't we? We're fixers. And so we do. And sometimes, even though the path isn't quite perfect, sometimes even though the results don't quite look like they would otherwise, we feel like the promise has been answered. See, here's something else I thought about this week. Sarai was a Hebrew woman, right? If Abram had had a child with Sarai, that would be a Hebrew child. But the child that he had with Hagar, she was an Egyptian. How many people know that that baby didn't look the same? It didn't look quite the same. Number one, God's timing wasn't the same as Abram's. Number two, so Abram decided to take matters into his own hands. And the last thing that I want you to know today is that in doing so, Abram made a real mess of things. Man, he made a mess. As we read on in the book of Genesis, we find that Sarai and Hagar begin to have hard feelings towards one another. Go figure. Go figure that when you share your husband with another woman and she's the one that can have a baby when you're not able to, and he's wanted to have a baby for all these years, you're going to have some tension. They started fighting, and eventually what happened actually is Hagar ran away. She took her baby and left. She ran away, and an angel went and found her under a tree and gave her a promise from the Lord that it was going to be all right, that she needed to go back and fulfill her responsibilities as a servant and live the right life, and that God was going to bless that baby. So she decides to name the baby Ishmael. You know what Ishmael means? It means God hears. She named the baby God hears because God heard her crying in the wilderness. So she goes back, and then 13 years later, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord comes and visits him again. And once again, the Lord affirms his promise. And this time, he's very clear that the promise would not come through Ishmael. The promise wouldn't come through Hagar's baby, but that Sarai would have a son. Abraham laughed when the Lord told him this. And then an angel came and visited Sarai and told her, and guess what she did? She laughed too. God changes their names. He says, Abram, you're no longer going to be called Abram, which is exalted father. Now you're going to be called Abraham, which means father of many. He changes Sarai's name to Sarah. And the following year, when Abraham was 100 years old, his son with his wife was born. And they named the son Isaac, which means laughter. Not long after that, Sarah saw this Ishmael, this slave girl's child, making fun of her son. How many people know she didn't take that very well? She wasn't real happy about that. So she tells Abraham that he has to send Hagar and Ishmael, his firstborn son, away. As Christina comes, instead of this man's story being filled with faith and with patience and with joy and with a miracle, it's filled with sorrow and strife and pain and frustration and hurt. All because he chose to force the promise before it was ready. I've seen this happen so many times in my life and in the lives of those around me. Relationships get strained or lost. Confusion and hurt take over where there should be joy and hope, all because we try to fix or force things before God's time. See, instead of getting Isaac, instead of getting laughter and joy, we end up with Ishmael in our lives. We end up with hurt and pain and frustration, bitterness, discontent. See, it's crazy when you think about the fact that all of the pain, all of the hurt, all of the sorrow could have been avoided if Abraham had simply trusted God and his timing. If only someone had taken Abraham and showed him Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. If only someone had taken him to the side and said, listen, Abraham, I got to tell you something. Let's look at this scroll together. You remember, this is the Lord's word, Abraham. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to God, submit to his plans, submit to his promise, submit to his timing. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Church, last week there were a few of you who said you were waiting on a promise. You lifted your hand and said, I'm waiting on a promise. It's not coming true, but I believe. Maybe today there's more of you here who would say, you know what, I'm waiting on a promise. If that's you, I want to encourage you to actually do that, to actually wait on the Lord, to trust his timing, to trust his plan, to trust in him for your future. Don't lean on your own understanding. Don't try to fix things yourself. Don't try to twist things and make them work. Don't sleep with a slave girl. Trust in the Lord. In all your ways, submit to him, acknowledge him, and he's going to make your path straight. He's going to make it work out. He's going to give you the promise. Because it's what he's planned on doing all along. Just because his time isn't the same as your time doesn't mean you need to go off and do things on your own. And I can promise you this, his miracle is better than anything you can force. I'm going to ask you to close your head and close your head. Bow your head and close your eyes. If you're here today and you say, you know what? Pastor, I just need to learn to trust in the Lord. I've been trying to fix things myself. Been trying to make things happen on my own, but it's just not happening. And what I'm getting looks nothing like the promise. If you're here and you say, I need God to help me be patient, and I need him to help me trust in him. If that's you, I want you to lift up your hand. Who else? Lord, I'm so thankful for this story. God, I think what I'm most thankful of is the fact that even after Abram made a mess of everything, you still kept your promise. You are a God who keeps your promises. And I know that our timing doesn't always align with yours. In fact, it rarely does. But I pray that you will help us to be patient. Help us to wait. And help us to trust in you. I worship you, Jesus.